Almost 300 dead, hundreds wounded, leaving a nation in shock. What's driving Sudan's conflict? Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. It is the worst violence in Sudan since its independence 67 years ago. Thousands of people have fled the capital while the army is fighting a paramilitary group in a dispute for power. Let's take a look at how this conflict started. Sudan began its shaky transition in 2019 when military leaders overthrew President Omar al-Bashir after a popular revolt. Bashir had presided over the country for nearly 3 decades. The Sovereign Council, a civilian-military partnership, would lead the transition. But there was a great deal of mistrust between the parties. In 2021, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan seized power, dissolving the civilian government and arresting top officials. General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, leader of the paramilitary group RSF, was installed as vice president. But now, the two leaders can't see eye to eye on many topics, including how to integrate the RSF into the military. And they are vying for power. The military is considered to be better trained and has an air force. But the RSF is heavily armed and has 100,000 members. We have a lot to discuss. Let's bring in our panelists. Let's start with Alyona Synenko. She's joining us from Nairobi. She's a spokesperson for the International Committee of the Red Cross. Also from Nairobi, Abdullahi Boru Halakhe is an Africa security and policy analyst, and Khalid Mustafa Medani is an associate professor at the Islamic Studies Institute at McGill University. He's joining us from Montreal. And Khalid, why don't I start with you? What do we know about what's happening in Sudan right now? We know that there was this 24-hour ceasefire yesterday, which just evaporated almost instantaneously. There's talk of another one today. What's the situation on the ground? What are we hearing? What do we expect?
Well, unfortunately, on the ground, it's really two elements. One of them are street battles between the armed forces and the very kind of battle-hardened militias, paramilitary militias of the Rapid Support Forces. And so what they're doing is trying to take over different bases in Khartoum itself, the capital, and they have bases in central Khartoum, in northern Khartoum, and also in southern Khartoum as well. And there's pitched battles around the airport still, even after these many days of conflict. In addition, there is a continued conflict with respect to the armed forces and the paramilitary militias in Medani in the north, in Darfur, and in the eastern part of the country. So unfortunately, we're seeing not only an expansion, but deepening of the conflict as each one of them wants to essentially establish facts on the ground. And both of them see this, it's clear, as a zero-sum game. Whoever wins the battle on the ground gets eventually, from their perspective, to not only control the military, but also potentially become the leader of the country. And your guest, of course, you're from Nairobi, will elaborate, but the humanitarian crisis in Khartoum, the greater Khartoum area, a capital of at least 5 million people, is extremely problematic and distressful, not only in terms of the 300 or so who have been killed as a result of the bombing and the street battles, but also, as you probably know, there's been an expansion of the humanitarian crisis with a great shortage not only of water and food, but also vital medical supplies. Most of the hospitals are not functioning, and people are trying their best to help each other, even though they're essentially held hostage in their own homes.
Yeah, Alyona, that's a good segue to you. I mean, it really looks like a huge humanitarian crisis. You really have your hands full if you're in the aid work, especially right now. You know, as he was pointing out, you've got basically 45 million people in this country, basically held hostage as they're caught in the crossfire and without, as he pointed out, in many cases, energy, food, water. Talk to us about how difficult this is for you.
This is very difficult for us, as you rightly pointed out. As humanitarian workers, the needs are enormous and we do have our hands full. But at the same time, it is extremely frustrating because our team members have been sheltering in place, just like the rest of the residents of Khartoum and other parts of the country where the fighting has been taking place, unable to move, because the fighting has been so intense, with shelling, bullets flying around. Some of them entered our offices, that there was impossible for them to do their work. And this is the worst possible situation for medical workers, for first responders, for volunteers of the Sudanese Red Crescent Society, all those people who are supposed to be there delivering assistance.
Alyona, another point, though, Khalid did a very nice overview of a lot of the issues going on in the country right now. But one of the others is that it seems like aid workers themselves are being victims of violence as well. We're hearing reports UN workers, NGO workers, they've been targeted, they've been attacked, their compounds and warehouses looted. What are you hearing from your people on the ground there? And just how concerning is that when you think about here are people there to help, and in many cases, they're also victims?
They are there to help. They are finding themselves in exactly the same situation like the rest of the population. The security situation has been spiraling out of control. We have had some break-ins into some of our offices in Darfur, and it is extremely difficult situation and frustrating situation. But for us, the most urgent priority is to be able to go outside, to be able to assess the humanitarian situation and start responding to the needs, because with every single hour that goes on, and with this uninterrupting fighting that goes, just more people are going to die, just more injured people are going to stay without medical treatment. And this is a horrific situation. The human toll is becoming enormous.
Abdullahi, the toll enormous, but right now, as Khalid pointed out, it doesn't look like there's going to be much headway. You have these two warring factions, and as he pointed out, you win the war, there's a good chance you run the country, and so they have no incentive at this point to give up their arms. It's interesting, though, we did hear from the UN representative for Sudan talking about just how dire the situation is. I want to share some of that, and I want to get your reaction on the other side. Let's listen.
The two sides who are fighting are not giving us the impression that they want mediation for a peace between them right away. Rather, they are calling on the other side to give up or to surrender, or on the other side to be disbanded. So that doesn't sound very much like preparedness to give in to or allow mediation efforts to succeed.
It almost sounds depressing as he talks about it, like he's really struggling here. Give me your sense of his words and what he had to say.
I think this is just a culmination of something that I think everybody knew was coming, but really was trying to look the other way for the situation to resolve itself. The two gentlemen, the two generals, that is General Dagalo and General Burhan, they came into prominence as part of General al-Bashir's sprawling military outfits to coup-proof his administration for fear of being overthrown. And for them, they don't know any better. The only way they know is doing what they are doing. If they could not, General Burhan was tasked by General al-Bashir to go and quell what was going on in Darfur. And the person he relied on as a commander was General Dagalo. If they could not spare General al-Bashir in trying to get to power, there is nobody that they are going to spare. But now that General al-Bashir is gone, now they are both facing each other. And they are, the ties that binds them together is violence. And it's largely the violence or the blood of the Darfuris who have not got any accountability for what transpired, what many call a genocide of the 21st century in Darfur. For many Sudanese, they feel betrayed by generals for generations now because they have taken disproportionate role in managing of Sudan since its independence. These are the last few days of the holy month of fasting. By this weekend, It's most likely going to be Eid. It is a celebration. For many Sudanese, it is not going to be celebration. They will be going without water, power, food. 1 in 3 Sudanese do not have, adequate food. They would rely on food aid. And for many, this is probably another chance for Sudan has missed to transition into a civilian authority, but instead they are looking at a beast. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when General Bashir was ousted, many Sudanese were jubilant. Many Sudanese in the diaspora are going back to build their country that was robbed of them. The generals that al-Bashir put in power are now the ones who are robbing them, even if al-Bashir is not there.
Yeah, Khalid, it's interesting because Sudan's history, in some ways, hasn't been written in ink. It's been written in blood. I mean, this is a history of coups and coup attempts, a civil war. You look at Bashir, he was toppled in a coup, but he also came to power in a coup in 1989. As one writer put it, as I mentioned earlier, 45 million people effectively being held hostage once again because of all this fighting. Talk to us about this country's history and give us a little bit deeper dive into these two men. As he pointed out, this has been an unsteady alliance from the very beginning, and now it's unraveling.
Well, as your guest rightly put it, it's a history of a militarization in politics in Sudan, similar to other African countries. But unfortunately, Sudan has had the dubious distinction of having the most coup attempts, 16 in all, since its post-colonial history. It's difficult to rehearse all of the history of Sudan, but I think for our purposes, beginning with the military coup of 1989, in the summer of 1989, can tell us a great deal about the present conflict. That was a coup that overturned a civilian democratic experiment. It ushered in an Islamist authoritarian regime under Umar Bashir. And that regime had two legacies that we should look at with respect to the present conflict. One of them was an attempt to control the economy, the domestic economy, through the military and the state, and one that unfortunately really tells us a great deal about the present conflict was the factionalization of different militias, of the security apparatus. The idea here on the part of Bashir was to establish coup-proofing, that is recognizing that the Sudan is prone to military coups. The Bashir regime factionalized these security apparatus in ways to forestall any attempted coup, but also, very importantly, forestall any pro-democracy protest that would overthrow his regime. We then turned to, very quickly, the October 2021 military coup against the pro-democracy forces and the coalition that was supposed to see over democracy. That coup was really a combination of the conspiratorial kind of agreement between Burhan and Hemeti himself. So I want to emphasize that until recently, they cooperated basically against the process of transitioning to democracy. Importantly, after that coup, they were not able to govern successfully because protests for democracy continued daily in Sudan. That forced them to get to the table under international auspices and try to figure out this framework agreement. Unfortunately, the framework agreement postponed this central issue of integrating the paramilitary group and militia into the army. Days before this conflict began, as you probably have heard, there was a huge dispute over this integration and demobilization of the paramilitary militia. On the one hand, Burhan wanted it to happen quickly in 2 years. Dagalo insisted that it should happen over the course of a long 10 years. That dispute signaled to both of them that if they were not to actually find a military solution, one of them would lose out in terms of consolidating their power over the military and over the country.
Yeah, indeed. Well, we have still much more to cover as we continue to look at the heartache and the fighting in Sudan. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment.
Modern vitality, born of ancient civilizations. Asia exemplifies diversity in its best sense. and welcomes changes at the fastest pace. Asia Today brings you the headlines from the most populous continent, puts in focus politics, economies, and faces, and takes you on a tour of the sights from the region and beyond.
I see a country on the move.
There's my opportunity.
Is it good to change so fast?
Yes, but it's a challenge.
We have one foot in the future.
But we never forget our past.
We need to talk to one another.
And listen.
More than 1 billion voices telling their stories. Rediscovering China, only on CGTN. All you need to know about China. China 24, only on CGTN.
Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion about the violence in Sudan. Abdullahi, it was interesting you gave us that perspective about that move towards the civilians trying to take back their government and have a democracy, a thriving democracy, and this kind of glimmer of hope that was there, which seems almost vanquished right now. And it's interesting, I was looking at social media today, there was a post, a woman describing what's going on in Sudan from the perspective of a civilian, and she said, they are fighting over seats of power while we are fighting just to be able to eat and drink. They are fighting to steal and exploit while we are fighting to eat, have education, and health care. And it seems like those were the fights that really toppled Bashir, and it's the fight still today. Give me your sense of that comment from just one civilian there.
That is exactly the kind of sentiment that you will hear from many Sudanese. They have been resilient since 29, even before that, worked so hard for overthrow of one general, for them to get 2 generals now. Sudanese are poorer than when al-Bashir was in power. Sudanese are hungrier. Sudanese have got nothing. But still, I think one of the things that I really would want to underline, not in a very, over-essentialized way, but in a very essential but elemental way, is the resilience of the Sudanese. In the month where most of them would want to go and be involved in more spiritual activities, they find this as a higher calling. But Burhan and Dagalo, to them, this is just another political game. They are so sure that one of them has to leave for one of the other to lead. But that is not, they don't know who they are going to lead. They're leading most of the Sudanese into utter deprivation. They're leading most Sudanese into more poverty. They are leading most Sudanese into having nothingness. Many Sudanese feel that their hopes have been taken away. I want to emphasize one element before I hand it over, Mike. It's that the Sudanese crisis will not stay in Sudanese. You saw the Rapid Support Force taking, hostage some of the Egyptian military. It just shows you another dimension to this conflict, because both Burhan and Dagalo are being supported by the Gulf countries, including Egypt, to stay in power. And as such, what is largely a Sudanese domestic affair is not necessarily a Sudanese domestic affair. It also affects the region. Egypt and Sudan have got tension brewing over, Egypt and Ethiopia have got tension brewing over the use of River Nile, following Ethiopia's building of the Renaissance Dam that will rely on River Nile. That is another element to it. Next door neighbor in Chad, there is, an ongoing, if you will, transition that is not fairly strong. It's very febrile. So this is a conflict that will not only involve Sudan and Sudanese who are desperate, who want something new, who fought for something new. They have braved all the machinations, including live bullets that have been thrown at them. And now in a densely populated area, the Sudanese army is bombing people, is shooting people from the top, but they're still on the streets. And I think we need to pay tribute to many Sudanese, despite what that person said in the social media, that they are still out there. I spoke to somebody in Khartoum yesterday, and he said he had a son who is unwell, and because they cannot cross the bridge into Khartoum, he's been going around everywhere to look for medicine for his son. That is not what many Sudanese wanted when in 2019 they supported the overthrow of General al-Bashir.
Alyona, I think that's a good segue to you. I mean, there's so many in desperate need of medicine and attention, and as you pointed out, you've got aid workers pinned down in this crossfire as well. They can't get it to them. This talk of a ceasefire, I mean, how much of a length of a ceasefire do you need to actually start getting stuff to people? And I mean, talk to us just about the logistics and just the difficulty of all of this.
Before I enter into the logistics and the difficulties of all of this, I just wanted also to react to some comments by the previous guests because they resonated with me. The fact that the world was preferred to look the other way, because this is exactly the same sentiment that we also felt as a humanitarian community. Because I think we should not forget that the humanitarian crisis did not start with this fighting, that the situation has been deteriorating for many years, and for us as a humanitarian organization, it has been increasingly difficult to keep the international donors, to keep the international community engaged and interested in a protracted crisis like the one we are facing in Sudan. And at the same time, like when you look at all the humanitarian indicators, they are all flashing red. We are dealing with over 1 million refugees. This is one of the largest refugee population in Africa. There are 3 million internally displaced people. The majority of them are in Darfur. For us, it has been in the past years increasingly difficult to get the necessary funding, to get the necessary support to do our work. And today, of course, what we're seeing today, the fighting is just going to add a terrible layer, like an additional layer with all the people who are wounded, because like when you treat gunshot wounds, it's a long-term medical treatment. And right now what we're hearing from the Sudanese is that the medical system is on the verge of total collapse. We have dead bodies lying in the streets for days now, and unless these dead bodies are collected and properly identified, we are going to face an increasing caseload of missing people with their families who will be searching for their loved ones for years, unable to know their fate. So the humanitarian consequences, the immediate humanitarian consequences that we're seeing right now, they are terrible. But we are also looking at the medium term and at the long term consequences of this crisis.
Khalid, I kind of want to pick up of what Abdullahi was talking about, and there's an American senator from Delaware, Chris Coons, who weighed in on what's going on. He says there is a path towards an end to the violence, but he's fearful there could be a civil war, or worse yet, a proxy war. And I think that there are other outside forces, and we've seen proxy wars in other countries, and they just bubble up and start rather quickly. What are your concerns there, and who are some actors who can actually pull some levers and try and bring both sides together and try and mediate this thing?
Well, as your guest rightly noted, there is a great fear of the expansion. In these kind of conflicts in Sudan and Africa in general, these kind of generals rely on financing, logistics from outside powers. In a nutshell, for the military leader Burhan, he has long been a client, let's say, or supported by the Egyptian regime, and Sisi in particular, and not only logistically but also politically. From the perspective of Egypt, it's very important that the stability of the country is secured, but even more importantly, to have a reliable ally in the Sudanese general. That's number one, and that has very much to do with the Nile waters, of course, interest. So that becomes really important. The Nile waters and water in general for Egypt is seen as an existential security issue, which is really important. Another element from the Egyptian side is that historically the countries are so close geographically, and in other ways there's less interest and often a fear of democratization. The notion of democratization and the possibility of instability in Sudan, or rather the influence of democracy in Sudan vis-a-vis Egypt, is another concern. The democracy is not popular, let's say, in that particular part of the world. There is another actor that I'd like to emphasize, and that has to be the United States and the international community. The United States has not, as your guest from Nairobi also pointed out, including the United Nations, have not had a coherent, robust kind of diplomatic presence in Sudan for many, many years. And unfortunately, the international community, with respect to the framework agreement, did not actually deal seriously with the outstanding issues. As an example, the international community, including the United Nations mission in Khartoum in Sudan, gave 1 month, if you can imagine, a short timeline for the negotiations around the framework agreement to encompass issues of integration of the militia, issues of dealing with the remnants of the previous regime's economic interest, issues of transitional justice. These issues in the African context, whether it's in Sierra Leone or Liberia or elsewhere, usually require not only benchmarks, but a long time. And this is why one of your guests were saying many people, most people in Sudan have seen all of this coming and warned about it. So to return to the initial question, what is to be done? I think that those lessons have to be learned by the international community and the regional powers. The severity of the conflict and the very, very clear threat of it spilling over across Chad and other countries in the east, and even Egypt is along the border of Egypt, is even one of the reasons today Libya has chimed in terms of mediating, Kenya, Djibouti. These are countries and presidents, South Sudan, all of them have insisted that there must be an immediate ceasefire, and these generals have to get back to the table. The missing link here, as one of your guests mentioned, is that there's no discussion of Sudanese civil society. The lack of full inclusion of those forces in the framework agreement is yet another reason that these generals were emboldened to do what they're doing today. So a coherent, very strong and rigorous intervention, especially by those countries that feel that this endanger them, is key here. And it is possible if we focus on that.
Well, let's hope it happens. I can't thank you all enough. Appreciate it. That's it for this edition of The Heat. But the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us.